because he has agreed to and committed to a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. Now what we see, and this is centrepiece for our discussions today, is that Putin is the one trying to delay
Ukrainian sovereignty and economic pressure on Russia, but also what Keir called a coalition of the willing, countries that would work with Ukraine on a peace deal and potentially be part of some sort of peacekeeping force.
In a sense, and you all know this, if Putin is serious about peace, it's very simple. He has to stop his barbaric attacks on Ukraine.
Here are some of the European NATO leaders at the weekend. It's all happy families, but how many of this group are actually willing? Well, the maker of the coalition is something that Keir Starmer is keeping fairly quiet about because it's an evolving initiative.
Remember when British leaders commanded respect on the world stage? In a stunning diplomatic exchange that's gone viral, Starmer was left stammering as both Russian and Ukrainian officials openly dismissed him as ineffective and weak. The video footage is painful to watch. Starmer visibly uncomfortable as Kuleba declares Boris Johnson was the superior leader. This isn't just another political gaffe. It's visual evidence of Britain's declining global influence happening right before our eyes. The question is, can Britain's international standing survive Starmer's leadership? Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now, back to the video. When Britain once ruled the waves, her diplomatic might echoed across continents. Today, under Keir Starmer's leadership, that global influence has withered to a mere shadow of its former self. The evidence isn't just concerning, it's downright alarming. Britain's closest allies and fiercest adversaries now openly question the UK's relevance on the world stage. Nothing illustrates this diplomatic collapse more clearly than the recent bombshell assessment from Ukraine's former foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba.
And agreed to a ceasefire. And the world is watching. And my feeling is that sooner or later he's going to have to come to the table and engage in serious discussion.
It definitely includes the United Kingdom and France because it's their idea, and it likely also includes Italy and Canada and maybe the Netherlands and perhaps the small Baltic states.
But, and this is a big but for us this morning in our meeting, we can't sit back and simply wait for that to happen. We have to keep pushing ahead.
Spain has ruled out participation. Germany cannot agree to such a commitment when it's in between chancellors. Poland has a pretty big army, but is clearly nervous that if it deploys a proportion of its forces to Ukraine, it'll be short of troops.
A man who has worked extensively with British leadership throughout Russia's brutal invasion has now delivered a devastating verdict on Starmer's performance compared to his predecessors. The only unpleasant conversation I had with British officials a couple of weeks before my resignation was about the delivery of Storm Shadow missiles and permissions to use them against certain targets, Kuleba revealed. This statement is particularly damning when you consider that until Starmer took office, Ukraine and Britain maintained an exemplary diplomatic relationship throughout the war. What makes this criticism especially biting is the stark contrast Kuleba draws between Starmer and former prime ministers. Both Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak demonstrated decisive leadership in their dealings with Ukraine. Johnson wasn't just any Western leader visiting Kyiv. He was the first to address Ukraine's parliament after Russia's invasion, receiving a hero's welcome upon his return in 2023, where he pledged to do whatever I can to help Ukraine defeat Russia. Similarly, Rishi Sunak wasted no time meeting President Zelensky shortly after becoming prime minister, making the journey to Ukraine to personally confirmed Britain's unwavering support. The message was clear. Britain stands with Ukraine, regardless of party politics. Yet Starmer, months into his premiership, hasn't found time for even a single visit to Kyiv. This absence speaks volumes about his priorities and has not gone unnoticed by Ukrainian officials. But perhaps most troubling is Kuleba's frustration regarding Storm Shadow missiles. These long-range weapons represent a critical capability for Ukraine's defense. Yet Starmer's government has introduced hesitations and restrictions where his predecessors offered clarity and support. This wavering has created the first diplomatic tension between the two nations.
Pushing forward and preparing for peace, and a peace that will be secure and that will last. And I think that means strengthening Ukraine.
To declare any future Russian aggression attack elsewhere in the north. So the UK will be a key participant. But of its available forces, there would likely be only about, say, 5,000 on the ground at any one time.
So they can defend themselves and strengthening, obviously, in terms of military capability, in terms of funding, in terms of the provision of further support from all of us to Ukraine.
And there needs to be 3 times as many troops to be available for whatever number is deployed. So, depending on the involvement, the RAF could play a part. Britain's Typhoons and F-35 fighter jets will be a real asset.
Since the war began, a stunning reversal of what had been an exemplary alliance. Meanwhile, as Britain falters with its allies, its enemies grow increasingly emboldened. Russian MP Ivan Popov's recent appearance on state television provided a masterclass in diplomatic humiliation. With calculated precision and cold dismissal, Popov called Starmer's threats misguided and naive, the kind of language reserved for irrelevant players on the world stage. Even more concerning was Popov's blunt warning that British troops would become direct targets for our missiles if deployed to Ukraine. This isn't just rhetoric, it's a deliberate exploitation of Starmer's diplomatic inexperience. The Russians clearly sense weakness in Britain's current leadership and are capitalizing on it with increasing boldness. The pattern is unmistakable. Where Britain once commanded respect, it now invites derision. Where it once led, it now follows. As Kuleba pointedly observed, under previous conservative governments, Britain coordinated with America but maintained its independent position. Now, under Labour, the UK has adopted a posture of simply following Washington's lead, a devastating reduction in Britain's global agency. This international embarrassment hasn't escaped the notice of British voters. Starmer's approval ratings have plummeted to just 35%, their lowest point since February. The British public recognizes what foreign observers have already concluded: their country's standing on the world stage is diminishing by the day. What we're witnessing isn't merely a temporary diplomatic setback, it's a fundamental shift in how Britain is perceived globally. For generations, the UK punched above its weight in international affairs through skilled diplomacy and decisive leadership. That carefully cultivated influence is now evaporating.
Secondly, being prepared to defend any deal ourselves through a coalition of the willing. We've begun that process, and this morning we can take it forward. And then thirdly, and really importantly, given the developments of the last few days...
But there are only a handful of squadrons of each of those, and they'd be working very, very hard. Now, France has more than 110,000 troops, but again, nowhere near that number would be deployed, and they still need 3 times as many as however many they have on the ground.
Pressure on Putin to come to the table, and I think collectively we've got a number of ways that we can do that. And so it's those 3 heads really that we're going to focus on in this meeting.
France also has Rafale and Mirage jets. They're very good, but not enough squadrons to do a major, enduring enforcement operation. And the rest of NATO pales in comparison to US military capability.
At an alarming rate, the implications extend far beyond bruised national pride. Britain's security framework relies heavily on its diplomatic relationships. As these relationships fray under Starmer's tentative leadership, the nation's strategic position weakens. Allies become less reliable, adversaries more aggressive, and Britain's ability to shape global events diminishes accordingly. Moreover, economic prosperity is inextricably linked to international standing. As Britain's diplomatic clout wanes, so too does its leverage in trade negotiations, investment opportunities, and financial partnerships. The cost of Starmer's diplomatic failures will ultimately be measured not just in lost prestige, but in very real economic terms. What we're witnessing is nothing short of a diplomatic crisis. The UK now finds itself increasingly isolated on the world stage, with major allies like the United States and France reportedly too consumed by their own problems to back Britain's hardline position against Russia. This isolation reveals a fundamental truth about Starmer's leadership. He's attempting to maintain an assertive foreign policy without the necessary diplomatic relationships to support it. Kuleba's assessment cuts to the heart of the matter. The Conservatives were coordinating with the Americans, but they did not restrict themselves to just following the Americans. This perfectly encapsulates the difference between effective statecraft and mere followership. Britain's international relevance doesn't evaporate overnight. It erodes through a series of missteps and hesitations that signal weakness to both friends and adversaries. The path forward requires more than just cosmetic changes to foreign policy. Britain must decide whether it will accept its diminished status or fight to reclaim the diplomatic respect it once commanded. The cost of continued decline extends far beyond political embarrassment. It threatens the very foundations of British security and prosperity in an increasingly dangerous world.